So I'm Stephanie Rosenblatt. I am an instruction librarian, but I'm also the Electronic Resources Serials Coordinator at Cerritos College. Before I was at Cerritos College, I worked at, oh yeah, thanks, April. I worked at Cal State Fullerton. I was the education librarian there. So I got to work with everybody from incoming freshmen that thought they might be future teachers all the way through our grad students and the EDD program. And that ended up being a really great resource for me when I did my own research, because the faculty there were very friendly and they were used to helping people who were at the grad level, at the master's level, do research, which is really where I was, because I have a master's in teaching and I have my MLS, and I did some research in both those venues, right, to get those degrees. But this was a real kind of scary hurdle for me. And if you know about the CSUs, you know you need to publish or you don't get tenure, right? So not only was I trying to research student learning, because of course I picked something really easy to research, but I had no idea really how to do it. So having those relationships was really great. And then this is my colleague, April Cunningham.
Hello, I'm April. I am an instruction coordinator at Palomar College. Until this past summer, I was at Saddleback College for 8 years, so also an instruction coordinator there. And in that work, I've obviously struggled with these questions of how do we know what students are learning, how do we work together to answer difficult questions as instruction librarians. I don't have answers to those questions, but I have experience with them. And I also work right now as a facilitator for the Assessment in Action project that ACRL started last year. For those of you who haven't heard about the Assessment in Action project, it's a year-long professional development for librarians who want to assess library something, whatever the librarian wants to assess, in terms of impact on students. And so we're working with librarians from all different kinds of institutions who have formed teams on their own campuses with people inside and outside their libraries. So we wanted to ensure that librarians were working with their institutional researchers, working with assessment in action, and working with possibly faculty, working with other leaders on campus. And what we do for them is provide a place where they can work with other librarians leading teams on other campuses through online, well, we use Moodle, so through online discussions, and then to in-person meetings. And so I have now a much broader perspective of all these big, difficult questions and how hard it is to answer them, and how exciting it is to try to grapple with how do we talk about library value, how do we show what libraries do for students. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
So earlier I gave you guys our working definition of action research, and I talked about what I hope that you guys will walk out knowing today, which is, articulate questions about your practice. That you're not going to get to practice using various methods and tools. You'll get to learn about them, and that you're going to understand the concept of action research. The action research has a cycle, like so many things. And it's like we've seen this cycle talked about in all the presentations today. I mean, any research really has this cycle, okay? Plan, act, reflect, share. The big thing in action research is reflection, and you do that a lot throughout the process, and we'll talk about what that looks like. But it's really all about recognizing that research is messy. You don't know where it's going to take you, and really you'll learn the most interesting things, like they were saying earlier, the stuff you didn't expect. So if you walk into a project thinking, say, my first project I did as a librarian, that students that attend the library, a bibliographic instruction session, will have better sources for their topic, on their topic, than students who didn't. And then after you get a great sociology professor to let you do your quasi positivistic study where you've got a control group and your research group, and you find out, no, they all get the stuff on their topics, right? It didn't matter they came to me or not. They still found research on their topics because the professor said they had to, and the professor told them what kind of sources to use. So I'm like, oh my God, I just wasted all this time. I didn't find that out. That's not true. But then, because I actually had to read their papers in order to determine if the sources were on their topics, I found out there was a bigger problem there. They had sources, but I could not see how they were using them to make any kind of argument, right? And I was like, well, that wasn't what I set out to study. Is that okay? how am I going to talk about this? Like, I see this thing, just me saying it, that can't be right. Okay, so you have to know that if you already know the answer or think you know the answer, it's not even worth researching, even if you need that study to get tenure. Because life is too short to find the answers to questions when you already know the answer. But anyway, so these are the stages to the action research process. I wanted to give you a little idea, just a brief history of action research if you're not familiar, because you'll also understand how I look at it, because I probably look at it in a very specific way, because like I said before, I got a master's in teaching. So my first research project was an action research project, because a lot of master's students in education do this, right? And I just had like a little case study, okay? So I do my little case study on my student, and I figure out what's going on with Jasmine, and I develop an intervention, and I try to document whether the intervention worked or not, and that was done. Oh, that was good. Okay. And then later, I'm teaching the education students. We start talking about action research again, and so I get a deeper understanding of what I was doing then, because when you're in it, you're still an outsider, so you're struggling to do it, but you don't really have that perspective. Because what I hadn't done, even though we were told to, because I was sick of doing it, was reflect. Because if any of you guys have gone through like teacher training or credential, or education students, you're asked to reflect so much, right? Like, it's a habit of mine, and it's good, because now every time I teach, right after I'm done teaching, in my head, I'm thinking over everything that went down and what was good and what was bad. There's never a time where I just walk out and it's over. I'm always doing that. I do it unconsciously. So they did train me well. But they trained me to do that within the context of my practice, but not within the context of being a researcher. And because even the second time I did an action research, I didn't do that, it caused me a terrible delay that we'll talk about later. But let me just give you my idea of the brief history of action research, okay? So it's first described or named, you could say, by Kurt Lewin, a psychologist from the 1940s, although the process was employed prior to this time. The methodology was adopted by a number of fields, including education, because it was believed, as Lewin stated, in order to change certain social practices, social scientists have to include practitioners from the real world in all phases of inquiry. The practice was supported by John Dewey's ideas about reflective teaching, but by the end of the 1950s, there was an increase in professional researchers in education, so that methodology fell out of popularity until the 70s, when it was kind of revived, right, and referred to as the teacher-researcher movement. Now, I really connect action research to teachers because that's my personal experience, right? But also because I think of all librarians as a type of teachers. We're all educating our students, whether or not we work face-to-face teaching them, or you're in the back trying to describe materials so they can find them in some logical fashion. I also think about us in the same way because we're often seen as research subjects versus researchers, right? Sometimes we're just seen sometimes as technicians, right? So like teachers, they're given a curriculum that was developed by experts, and it's their job to execute the curriculum. And then another expert will come in and watch and observe, and if they've done it correctly, it should work, okay? And sometimes librarians, even though we're professionals, we're relegated, we're service providers as well. And so it's really easy for people to want to observe us and tell us how to do our jobs, but we are intelligent people that are interested in learning, and we're curious, and so we're really the best people to decide how to do our jobs really well. We're also, like teachers, part of these larger systems that have their own agendas that are ruled by politics and money, budgets, and things like that. And so we're often told what we need to be measuring or doing. And we have, without being able to determine if it's appropriate for us or not. And I'm saying, wait a minute, we should be telling them what should be measured, right? So I think if you got nothing out of today other than the fact that research is messy, I should just try it. There's some people in this room that will be likely to help me, then we would be really happy, because research is messy. You should try it, and you'll be able to find a lot of help. There are kind of like, you could think of there's a continuum with action research, kind of based on the state of mind of the person doing it, the desired results, and the reason why the research was started to begin with. And you can break that down into three categories: technical, practical, emancipatory. So in the technical side, the person doing it is seen as a skilled craftsman. So this is more like the imposed research. Like your manager wants you to research something, or you're being asked to assess your student learning outcomes, but maybe they're not outcomes that you developed yourself, right? The goal is to make existing practices more efficient or effective, often through inspiring change in others. When you're in charge, let's say you're the instruction coordinator and you're trying to get all the librarians to go along with what you want, you try to get them to buy in to what your idea is, right? But really it's being driven by someone else. Then you can kind of look at practical. This is often where I find myself. You see yourself as a professional, and so what you want to do is you want to serve your students and patrons better within the context of your professional ethics or social mores or the constraints of the existing system. You generate the question yourself, but you're still feeling, you're gleefully bound by the constraints of the system, you could say, right? And then there's the one that is very exciting, which is critical. Like there's stuff that is just bugging you. It's like that you want to investigate commonly held beliefs to just debunk them. You're working for some kind of broader social issue, okay? And so you might end up forming a group and you guys decide to investigate those things together. You can slide all over the place depending on what kind of problem you're investigating, and not every problem needs a whole action research cycle, right? Like if I'm trying to figure out if I should renew a database or not, that's not action research. If I'm trying to figure out how students are using my ebook collection, because I work at a community college and the vendors are telling me something, right? But they don't really know my students. That might end up leading to an action research question because I can tell that they're using things in GVRL, like reference sources. But are they really using the other standalone monographs? And if they aren't, why not? Is it because they don't know they're there? Is it because they don't own an e-reader? Is it because of our the way that we let them, our loan rules? You know, there's all these things. I have no idea. So that's kind of a broader question. So just kind of to summarize what action research is, it's informed by questions of praxis. The question should come out of the librarian's experience. It's collaborative. It's reflective and critical. And at the end, something's going to change. And if it's not a practice, it's maybe a belief that you held so dear before. Like maybe the impact of my instruction sessions.
So we're just going to go through the stages of the action research process to give you a little bit of a sense of what it would be like to do it. So when you're planning to plan, the first question is action research even the best thing to do? You've heard a little bit about how it's different from just answering a very instrumental question, which is, do we renew this database or not? You've also heard that there are different kinds of action research, and so some research that practitioners do is not action research. You can be a practitioner doing research about your work and not have it necessarily become action research. So if getting into critical questions about your role in this bigger context is not something that you're necessarily interested in, that doesn't mean that you can't do practitioner research. And it also, I would say that there are lots of steps in this process that we're going to talk about today that you can still use. But you do want to think about that, is how are you approaching your question? What kind of question are you interested in asking? Because I want you to be, hopefully all of you are already thinking about, okay, here are some problems I can think of. Here are some questions I might ask, because we are going to ask you to jot a few notes down about that. You do have handouts, so you might want to figure out where those are right now, because in a few moments you'll be using them. So you will probably have other goals for your action research, for whatever research you're doing. Maybe it is inspired by some accountability. Maybe it's inspired by a question that your supervisor raised with you. So sometimes you start your assessment or action research to respond to something. But if it's action research, you probably are also asking a question like this. Is the consequence of your work, are the consequences of your work measuring up to the professional standards and values that you have? And that is an action research question because it starts with you. So that's the first thing that action research has to do. It has to start with you, not something outside of yourself. The standards that you've set for yourself, the work that you do, and then understanding very clearly, having a much more realistic sense of what the consequences of your work have been than we sometimes have when we aren't being very reflective. And once you start to understand what are the consequences of your work and are you meeting your own values, that can start to lead to questions of your place in a bigger context. That's where the question becomes critical. Because then you start to question, what are the things that I've taken for granted? What are the structures that are in place that I thought would never change, but now I need to take responsibility for getting them to change because as hard as I'm working, I'm not having the impact that I want to have. Those are the kinds of messy outcomes that can happen when you start an action research project. So you want to kind of have those in mind. And this is, I think it was Steve Hiller who talked about assessment for advocacy, not just for improvement. And it's asking those critical questions that can start to show you, do you have something there that you can use for advocacy, and do you need to be advocating? And most of us do, for the things that you know will make your work more effective. So now's the time to start to think about your own work, how this could be applied in something that you're interested in right now. You've heard an example from instruction, and I will be using examples from Stephanie's experience throughout, but I believe that these questions can be asked about a lot of our work in libraries because we know that we're working off of our professional and personal values. We want to have impact on or influence on students, faculty, our institution in certain ways, and we want to think about how are those things working and how are they not working. So the example that Stephanie talked about was that she suspected that students who came to her sessions would learn more about research and have more effective research practices in their papers than students who didn't come. And so, turned out not to be the case. But when she started out, that was a totally reasonable thing to think. And so her preliminary question was something along the lines of, what's the difference in the types of sources students use when they've come to an instruction session and when they haven't? And so that's the kind of question that you might be able to generate from your own work. So I'll give you a few minutes to think about that.
Yeah.
How many minutes do you think?
Just 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
So you can even, and if you can't think of something, like just what's annoying you?
Yeah, if you don't have a question yet, just...
What's annoying you? What seems wrong? What just seems wrong or isn't working? Because there's something with all of this.
Yep.
It's just not working.
Yep. What do we keep trying to do and it just doesn't have the impact or influence that we thought that it would? And so you found that spot on your handout? There's a section for putting that.
It's on if you flip it over. The first page. It's on the back of the first page.
The back of the first page. All right, so with more time in a session like this, we would give time for groups to talk and find commonalities, because I'm sure that people in this room, there are somebody else in here who shares your question or your frustration. And so with the questions that or issues that you've written down right now, this would be something to spark conversation during the reception at the end, when you go back to work, with somebody you're used to talking to about these things. It could be the beginning of a new action research project for you. But we'll let you just sit with those right now. And as we move on, you can kind of think about what would be the possible next steps. So in order to animate your plan and really put some flesh on it, you would want to find out what is the situation regarding this issue or question right now. And Steve Hiller mentioned that a lot of us assume we need more data when really we have data. Or we assume we need more data than we actually need. And so we want to encourage you to see that you already have access to a lot of information. You may not think of it as data, but you have access to observations that you've made, you have access to lots of numbers, lots of libraries collect all sorts of numbers that you might not be using. So in this phase of thinking about what data you already have, you might also think about what data could you easily get. And you can find space to write about that on your handout. One of the things that I read about action research that really resonated with me was the idea of a reconnaissance stage in your planning. And your reconnaissance stage is a time when you start kind of a basic analysis of the data that you actually have. And this is when you can have a much clearer sense of what's really going on with this issue than maybe you have had in the past. And you get the clearer sense by coming to whatever your evidence is, data, observation, discussions with colleagues, with kind of putting your expertise aside for a little bit. Really being willing to see maybe something surprising in what you find. So in Stephanie's example, her reconnaissance phase was kind of long. It involved needing to get data from student papers and do an initial analysis of that. And that was her first chance to really get a clear sense of what was actually happening. Because before that, she was working on professional judgment, she was working on what she'd learned from other librarians, she was working on her hopes and dreams, but until she actually saw that data for the first time, her question wasn't fully animated. It didn't have enough behind it to really be the right question. So the reconnaissance phase is your chance to refine your question based on the things that you actually have happening, not just what you hoped would happen or what you heard was happening or what happened 10 years ago before you got there and it's just always been that way ever since, all that kind of stuff. Reconnaissance is your chance to really identify key issues. And so, as I mentioned, you might be thinking about data that you already have. You can start making notes on your handout. But to bring us back to our example, when you have your first question, in this case, how are students different if they come to a library session or not, you start to think about what's possible. So Stephanie could have found ways to observe students' use of sources in their papers besides looking at them. But obviously we would think about bibliographies, or should she look at the entire paper, and once she did that, she saw something totally different than when she was just analyzing the bibliographies. She could have chosen to do faculty surveys about what they observed their students doing with sources, or maybe if she'd been at a school that had electronic portfolios for students, that would have been a totally different kind of assessment. Or talking to students themselves, student focus groups, something really informal, hearing about how students use sources or what difference it makes when they come to a session. So there are different choices you could make at that point regarding the data that you have and the data that you need. And as you analyze this initial evidence, that's when you can actually figure out what the key issues are. Until then, you don't know. And I don't want to speak for Stephanie. What I hear her saying when she says that the key issues were not what kinds of sources were students using after library instruction. Her key issue, she realized, was how are students incorporating sources? And so if that's the key issue, that moves your question not just into a different direction, but really from a different place. So now you have to ask questions about what role does library instruction, or can library instruction even play in that bigger key issue? And your key issues might be a time, we mentioned lit reviews earlier, but your key issues, maybe that's the time that you go to the literature, not before you find out your key issues and you're still working on assumptions. Your key issues won't therefore come from the literature, they come from your own experience. And we are going to talk about sharing your results later, but also at this phase of your planning and finding key issues, this would be a time to start to think about who's going to be your audience for the results that you come up with. Who are you going to try to influence? Who are you going to advocate with? And what are they going to need to know to be able to make a different decision or make a change? So before you get too far into your own data collection and analysis, having that end point in mind can be helpful in thinking about not just what kind of new data you need to collect, but also how are you going to try to report it? Who are you going to talk to along the way? Who are you going to have be a critical friend, maybe who you hadn't thought of before, but somebody else who also shares a concern for this new key issue that you've identified. And for our example, that could end up being people in a writing center, people teaching composition courses. It may turn out that it's not always other librarians. and it may take you outside of your immediate context. So now we're going to talk, before we do that, this is just to review some of the things that you'll want to make sure that you have in your plan, is how are you going to do these things. And so some of the things that you would need to do are just have a sense of being kind of easy on yourself. So you know there are going to be interruptions and competing priorities, and this may not always be the thing that you can work on week to week, but have that be part of your plan. Acknowledge that and have a way to deal with it. Keep your big pictures in mind, and when you're identifying sources of help and critical friends, as I mentioned, you might be making connections with people you hadn't necessarily worked with before. And the top one on the list is the one that's probably most important, but the one that's hardest to do, which is to keep a journal. And it doesn't sound that bad until you actually sit down and try to write about what you just did. And then it feels awful. And then you won't want to do it. But I promise that it will make a big difference. And you can think about it as something else. It could be your research notes. It could be a memo to your future self. It could be a blog that you're keeping. But basically it comes down to it's a journal. It's going to be a list of the stuff you did and mostly how you felt about it. So this helps you to see where you started, because you start to forget what you didn't know as you start to learn new things. And you want to have that chance to look back on that. And it also gives you really a place to bracket your own assumptions. So as you start to see that maybe the things that you've always thought weren't right, it can be hard to let those go. But if you're journaling about them, you can kind of put them there and let them be, and then see a little bit more clearly what's really out there. So I want to encourage you to try to do that, whether you're doing action research or not, anytime you start an assessment project. I will also try, and we will make a pact with each other that we're all going to try. So the next stage would be ACT, so we're going to hear about that.
Okay. So like she was saying before, I thought I had this really simple research project, and I would have it, at least a rough draft, done by my first year and be well on my way to tenure, and I got stuck. And I found it really paralyzing for multiple reasons, mostly the tenure clock, right? But also because I knew that there was something going on, but I just didn't know how it would be valid for me to describe it. And so it was really great that I was the education librarian working with College of Ed, because I start understanding data collection and analysis in a different way. Like, I don't have to have a large sample size. It's okay. That you can look at the same collection of data more than once. That's not cheating. That if I go and read through it and I pull out themes and then I decide how to describe those themes, like when they're evident or not, that's also not cheating, right? That it's okay to have that kind of process, right? So you have to think I have 60 student papers that I'm looking at, and I'm identifying what I'm not seeing, and my question becomes, are students able to synthesize their sources? How do you measure synthesis? And so I did do a literature review, and I found the value rubrics. Are you guys familiar? It's like the AAC. Yeah, they have this set of value rubrics, and they talk about synthesis, and they talk about information literacy. And so I was able to pull criteria from those rubrics and then look at it in terms of the assignment that had been given by the sociology professor, and I came up with a set of criteria I was comfortable with. The other reason why I became comfortable with this process is, I was a 6th grade teacher for a couple years. K through 12 teachers write assessments all the time. They grade their students, evaluate them all the time, and sometimes the assessment's crappy and sometimes it's good, and they're giving people grades on it which determine whether or not they get into your school. Nothing I do can hurt the students I'm studying. Do you know what I'm saying? So part of my stress was like, I'm doing it wrong. Me doing it wrong doesn't hurt anybody. Maybe I'm embarrassed, but it was like this big deal. Everything had to be perfect, and it doesn't. Because when I was a 6th grade teacher, I had no problem grading those kids, right? So just think of it that way. You're grading a process, just relax. I'm just like, get stressed out and relax. Okay, but this is what you're doing in the ACT phase. And this is the part that's hard. Collecting the data is relatively easy. Like we said before, you got a bunch already, and we're really good at collecting data as librarians. Analyzing the data is something completely different. It's an evil process, right? We put it off forever. And I'm going to talk a little bit about analyzing data. I'm going to show you guys a zillion tools. They're all on the blog. You've got in your handout, you could put like a star next to the one you think is kind of cool. I'm not an expert in all of them. And it's like every time that I do anything with statistics, I relearn it. Okay? But it's okay, because every year I learn a little bit more. So we're going to look at that. Okay. All right. We're going to look at, these are the ones we're going to look at today. Some of them you may already know. Maybe I'll show you something cool and new about it. Google Forms, Tableau Public, our friend Excel, oh, those rubrics, LIWC, Word, and TextStat, okay? And the majority of these things can be used for qualitative or quantitative data. Like, it depends on what you're looking at. I mean, each tool has its own specialty, okay? So I'm just going to show you them in order. How many of you guys have used Google Forms before? Right, okay. So I find a lot of times if I can kind of eyeball all the data I've collected, right, and I can kind of look at it together, I can get an idea of something that's going on, and that'll help me develop another phase. So maybe you guys have already seen this before, but this right here is a survey I just sent out. If you're a community college librarian, you might have gotten it. At my college, every year we do what's called a unit plan, and that's where we make our resource requests. And so we don't have an instruction room on my campus. We have a room, we don't have a lab. So we teach about 200 sessions a year, just like in what I call the chapel. We have a screen and they have seats and that's it. So I really think it's important that we get a lab, but I want to convince my campus, and I also have to temper my expectations because I came from a CSU, and it could be that the majority of community colleges don't have these kind of resources. I don't know. Everyone I know has one, but that might not be true, right? Because the librarians I know are from Skill, and that might mean that they work at a certain kind of place. So I sent this survey out, and I just wanted to show you what you can get if you hit the little form button and analyze your research. I get something like this, right? And that's already telling me something. There's a lot more there, but that might be all I need to do to pop in my unit plan to convince my stakeholders, hey, man, we're being left behind, or whatever, right? There's also, have any of you guys seen Tableau Public? Oh, this is so cool. Okay. It's this really great data visualization tool. There's a free version that you download onto your PC. And what's fun about it is you bring your data in, like you could say in an Excel spreadsheet, and then you can play with it. Now you have to kind of massage the data in the back. So what you're looking at right now is, this is my list of the community colleges in California. And the dots, they're slightly different sizes. You can't see them now because I'm still working with it. For the people that have a lab and people who don't have a lab. Because I wanted to be able to show my, administration, hey, everyone around us has a lab. Or it's hit or miss, right? Because that's our competition, right? So I have to still play with it to get the colors to show up. But it's there. It put it on, I got zip code information. I was looking at nominal data. It was like, you have a lab or you don't have a lab, yes or no. I had to change that into 0 for no, 1 for yes, right? And then I have to go back in. But all I did was it was on the Excel spreadsheet. I downloaded it off my Google form. I threw it in here, and I didn't even really know what I was doing. I was just kind of moving stuff around until I got it to show something. Which, that sounds really sloppy, right? But that's how it's going to work, and it's okay. Later, you can be more exact about it. But I'm still seeing something. And maybe I would have learned, oh, wow, no one around here has a lab. I'm not going to show them that one. Okay. I'm just being, don't tell. Okay. Our friend Microsoft Excel. I find in most of the work I've done so far, because I'm looking at small data and I'm not trying to make a broad generalization about library instruction, that my questions are answered with descriptive statistics. I don't need inferential statistics, right? So Excel can do both things, but there's a data pack you can download into Excel, and you can do a lot of cool stuff that you can do with SPSS. You guys know SPSS? Like the statistical program that social scientists use. When I was at Cal State Fullerton on faculty there, I was able to download a free SPSS right to my computer. It was awesome. I can't do that anymore. I'm at a community college. And I don't know if you guys can do it at the UCs if you get the same software access that your faculty gets. So Excel, you can run a lot of statistics. You just have to know a little bit more about what you're doing than if you were using SPSS. But But yeah, the difference between descriptive statistics and inferential statistics is descriptive, you're describing the data you have by organizing, graphing, or tabulating, and then inferential, you're going to make a larger hypothesis. And maybe you'll do that later. You know, if you discover something that you think is a big deal, you'll do a larger study, and then you'll have enough data to be able to do that kind of stuff. Also, when you're working with data, you have to know what kind of data you're looking at. So you've got, 4 different types: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. So I was saying earlier that my yes/no question became nominal data, right? It's the same thing like the sex of a person, male or female. You're either male or you could have 3, right? But they don't have a value. Like I might apply a 0 or 1, like a binary value to them, but that doesn't mean anything. It's all good. And either answer is okay, right? Then you've got ordinal. That's like those Likert scales, right? So it just means that the categories are ranked in relation to each other, but there's not necessarily the same amount of distance between each rank, right? So you really like it, you hate it, there's the little ones in between, but everyone has their own different way of seeing that, okay? So those are ordinal numbers. Then you've got intervals, which are supposed to be, in theory, grades, but we don't really know, where you've got, A, B, C, D. It's supposed to be gradated, like it's the same in between each thing, or you could like ages, right? Okay. And then ratio. Ratio's like interval, except that 0 has real meaning. So the thing is, you have to know what you're measuring and what kind of number it is so that you can decide what kind of statistical test you need to run on it. Because for some things you want a median, and for some things you want a mean. Anyway, but, okay. So right now you're looking at Excel, and what I've used Excel for in the past is to make pivot tables. Are you familiar with that? Some of you are. It's kind of like when you're looking for correlation between data. So if I wanted to know like how many students who came to a library instruction session met the professor's requirements versus how many who didn't come to the session that met the requirements, I would do a pivot table because I want to see the correlation between attending the session and meeting the requirements or exceeding the requirements, which is how I found out, they all mostly did except for 2, and they were the people who came to my session. Okay, so rubrics, you guys probably already know. Word is really great for when you're assessing qualitative data. If you want to keep track of the various themes that you're finding in your data, you can figure out a word table. You can make a table in Word, and then you can start recording what you're finding. And then just these I'll just show you this one really cool. This kind of automates doing that kind of work, linguistic inquiry word count. And then there's another one called TextStat, where you can download collections of like free responses, and they will either look for linguistic inquiry word count will look for the like emotional timbre of the language, and then TextStat will look for how many times a certain word appears, and then you can go in and investigate it further. Okay.
All right. So we're getting towards the end of our cycle. You will have acted and analyzed some data, and along the way you'll be reflecting on your results. So reflection is partly about evaluating the effects of the changes that you made. So we said that the beginning of plan was to have a reconnaissance phase, so you figured out what happened, and then you would do something, make a change, have an intervention, and then the data that you're analyzing it with these tools that you just heard about would show you, hopefully, whether or not, or would suggest whether or not there had been any effect of the change that you made. So the kinds of questions to really be asking at this stage would be, what worked, but more importantly, what did you expect to work that didn't work? So what failed? And how well did it work? Or how much did it fail? And then the why, as much as you can, and this is where your reflection really becomes so important, because none of the tools that we showed you can answer this question of why for you. You have to do your own explanation of that, using your own professional judgment, using your working theories, and you need to be able to explain that to somebody else, which is where your journaling can become so important when you're ready to start to try to explain. So maybe understanding what were some limitations of your design, that would be something that your journal would help you to recall. Maybe understanding why you had done some of the things you did, your journal can help with that too. So this would also be a time, once you see whether or not your change had the effect you wanted it to have, this would be another time to go back into the professional literature. So to compare with what you tried, to see if anybody else has ever tried it before and what happened for them. And if you find that the consequences of your actions still aren't meeting up with your values, now is really the time to kind of grapple with why that might be. What are structural conditions that are keeping that from happening? What new alliances do you need to form to make that possible, to answer that question or ask that question in a new way? So from this example that we've been talking about for Stephanie, she could potentially have acted in a way to intervene with faculty. Let's say that when she figured out that students didn't make a difference if they'd been to the library or not, maybe she would offer faculty a workshop on changing something in their assignment requirements, to scaffold something in that would push students more to analyze their sources before they put them into their paper, or to discuss research in some other way in their own classes. Or she could have taken an action with the students themselves. She could have done something one-on-one with them. She could have offered them some sort of tutorial to add to these issues of analyzing sources. If those were her actions, then at the end, if she figured out, let's say, that her interventions with faculty didn't end up changing what they did. I can't imagine why that would happen, but you can maybe use your imagination and think about faculty who would not change. And but let's say that two professors later wanted to meet with her to talk about other assignments. That would be some other kind of influence that she had that she wasn't expecting. That may be a change that was the result of her work, even though it wasn't what she had wanted. Or if she did students' surveys to see if they had understood the purpose of using sources in their papers, then she would have different information about what to teach them about incorporating sources later. So it would be a different part of her cycle, and she could filter that back into her work. So as you're reflecting on what changed, what your effect was, you would also be reflecting on changes in your perspective. So when I think about perspective, I think about, well, what was I like when I asked that initial question? And then what am I like and what do I understand differently when I'm changing my question, when I've revised it? So if we have our preliminary question, which you remember, what's the difference between students who are at instruction sessions and those who weren't? The new question could end up being, after all of those interventions and some things working and some things not working, the question could change to more about how does the library even have a role? What should the librarian be doing to get the changes in the things that we really care about for students? Do I care that students used the top journals in their field if I'm working with freshmen? Maybe that's not something I care about. But do I care about them understanding how to incorporate sources no matter what kind they are? Then I need to ask that kind of question if that's what I care about. So what is the role for librarians in resource-based learning? What can be a reasonable expectation that librarians should have of the influence that one-shot instruction can have? And if we change what we assume is possible, do we move our efforts in a different direction? Do we spend time doing something else? That's how we can get from a very personal question of my own work with a very defined set of students to now having a question that's more about how do I work in this bigger system? And that's a more critical question and a much messier question. And you would need to go back then and think about, okay, what can I observe about this? What can I try to change? What influence can I have? So in our assessment cycle, we're coming to the end. You've investigated a problem. You've learned about maybe how much more complicated the problem was than you thought it would be at first. But you've also found that you can empower yourself to ask these bigger questions, that you can get a little bit of distance from your day-to-day grind so that you can find new allies, work with different people, expand your zone of impact, so that instead of only thinking about what happens in your own classroom, thinking about the network or the environment, the interplay of all of the things that we know are happening for students. And how can we be an active part of that? Mostly we need to really see what those connections are to know where we can have more influence. Now, the last part would be sharing, and so we'll talk about that briefly, and I'll pass it back to Stephanie.
Yeah, just really fast. So I guess what I just want to say is share what you learn. So having worked with a lot of education students, you know that there's a lot of practitioner knowledge that's kind of locked up in dissertations and theses and no one's ever reading it. Because if you're not required to publish as part of your job, you might not make the effort to publish. But there's more than publishing to share what you've learned. Something like this, a poster session, a brochure, conversation at a department meeting. All of those places are places to share. But I think the fact that you are talking about research that you're doing, even with, other faculty that do a lot more serious research than you do, opens up a broader conversation, and people understand the contributions that you're making, and then the understanding that you've gained, someone else can learn from it as well. So it's all well and good that you learn something, but it could be much more powerful if you just share it even informally with your colleagues, because it might make them change their practices as well. Because you hear about stuff or you read about stuff, but you think it won't work on your institution. But if your colleagues hear that it actually worked for you, they're probably more likely to try it out for themselves. And that's really it for us.